Today's interview is probably one of the biggest highlights for me as I chat with the hidden gem in the animal rights movement, filmmaker and undercover investigator, Gemunu de Silva. Fun fact, Gem was the pioneer who put undercover investigations on the map in the United Kingdom and probably even in all of Europe with his first documentary, Meathead. This documentary provided an alarming expose of the horrors of factory farming. After a flourishing career working on film projects with various international animal protection and animal rights groups, Gem co-founded Trax Investigations, a contract agency that works with animal rights and animal protection groups across the globe on various undercover investigative projects. To date, Trax has completed over 260 investigative film projects for many different animal rights organizations in over 50 countries. In fact, Trax's work has been instrumental in sparking legislative change that will then go on to save the lives of countless animals. In this interview, Gem recalls his early days as a punk aficionado, his subsequent entry into animal rights and other forms of social justice, his time disrupting hunts with his hunt saboteur crew, and experiences as a man of Sri Lankan descent at the dawn of the grassroots animal rights era in the UK. I have a strong feeling that you are going to love this conversation. So I'm going to stop yapping about, and I am deeply, deeply humbled, honored, and over the moon excited to bring you the spectacular trailblazer, Gemunu de Silva. What an immense honor to have one of the OGs in undercover investigation work. Welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour, Gemunu de Silva.
Thank you, Shriya, so much. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast and hopefully share some stories and inspire some of your listeners into animal activism.
Oh, absolutely. I again learned of you through a couple other podcasts that I listened to. One is the Species Unite podcast and Our Hen House. And it's such a joy listening to your stories, and I have so many questions. So hopefully you're prepared for me to really, really drill in and get all of the good stories out and ask some questions about your experiences and words of wisdom. So again, truly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to chat with us.
Please fire away. I haven't done that much media in the past, and I haven't done that many podcasts. So you probably mentioned the 2 or 3 that I've actually done. So it was really nice to get new audiences and tell people a bit about investigations and how they've happened and how they've developed over the last 35 years since I've been doing them.
Yes. I'm sure you have a lot of insights on how investigations have evolved. But I personally, and us at Animal Activism Mentorship as well, we really value the importance of finding connection in our stories and our journeys into animal rights. And I think there's a lot to be said to finding commonality, even in the smallest of things, especially when we are in the animal rights movement. So for you, what was your journey into animal rights and how did you connect with the cause?
It took a while. I was born in Sri Lanka and grew up in Sri Lanka, went to school there and didn't really have a connection with animal welfare, animal rights. I'd go to the zoo and go on the back of an elephant, and that was part of common culture back in the 60s. And then I moved to the UK, and much the same really. I didn't really have a relationship with animal rights. And the only relationship I would have with animals is to eat them on the plate. And then, as many people would have, had a kind of a political awakening in my teens, really, my late teens, and got involved within activism, and not just animal activism, all political activism. And that really largely came around through punk rock music. It was interesting. I've just listened to your podcast with Tyler, and he had a very similar journey. And that was the music of protest. It was the music of protest. It was the music of rebellion. It was the music of making a difference.
I believe Jake Conroy also had that connection. The Cranky Vegan, who's also a guest on the podcast and co-host of Radicals and Revolutionaries, also came through with the punk scene.
It was a great movement, because this was I got involved with that in the early 80s, and it was for the internet, and it's the days before YouTube, and it was a way to actually get information. So these bands, not only did you listen to the music, which was, and listen to the lyrics. Well, you couldn't listen to the lyrics because they were kind of indecipherable, really. It was shouting. But what you did get is, you actually got a physical product, an album, a sleeve cover, and the bands would actually talk about and have the lyrics on it, and they were kind of profound lyrics, and they were about anti-war, they were about the peace movement, they were anti-feminism movement, and they were about animal rights. And that was my first introduction to animal rights. It was part of this whole spectrum of oppression, really, talking about oppression, and it was putting it together. So I think these days you might call it intersectionality, but in those days it was oppositional culture. It was all about oppositional culture against the norm. And that was what brought me firstly into animal rights, is listening to this music and getting aware of the issues of meat eating, the issues of animal research. But there was also another factor. So that was on one level, on a very cultural level, it was very much the punk rock music. And the other one, which for many activists in the 80s, was reading Peter Singer's Animal Liberation book. Because I went to college, and part of my course was, on one of the reading lists, was the Animal Liberation book on speciesism, and it was, wow, this actually put things into context. So it was about speciesism.
Of course, that required one to read such a pro animal rights book.
Yeah, it was a radical geography book, a geography course in Oxford, and
interesting.
And also in a part of the course was also reading about the nuclear war, the threats of nuclear war. So it was basically a bunch of lefties running the course, and so they introduced us to other alternative ideas that we weren't aware of. And I remember having to debate speciesism, back in 1983, 1984, and basically, once you kind of get the basic tenets that animals have rights, and to deny them rights is speciesist, you kind of you get it, really. And and it brings in, it's part of a bigger picture. So if you're against racism, if you're against sexism, you have to be against speciesism. It just seemed to be a natural progression, and they were the things that I was obviously against, because especially racism, because of my background, for obvious reasons. I had experienced that, and I was just thinking, okay, this is a natural progression.
Wow, yeah, that makes total sense. And you've actually answered one of my very, very pressing questions about punk rock music, in that when I heard that a lot of activists came into animal rights activism through this genre of music, I actually listened to a couple of songs and I was like, I don't know what they're saying, but I'm glad that you clarified how, that you got access to lyrics and the messaging, because I was like, how is one deciphering the words to be like, yeah, we're gonna go fight against all oppression? But that makes a lot of sense. No shade to all the punk fans out there. I'm just a noob when it comes to music.
No, of course you can't decipher the lyrics. It's impossible to decipher the lyrics. But you have on those days, again, just before YouTube, you had they'd write the lyrics, and that was part of the process of getting information out. And I think that was a very important.
That's how we got our daily news, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very important part of that movement. And they also had fanzines, etc., which was and that would include some of the lyrics, and there was kind of an alternative culture of printed material that goes around it. So yeah, you wouldn't pick it up by just listening to it.
Okay, that's good to know, because I was like, am I not a true activist? I don't understand the words. Okay, that's helpful. So how did all of that, culminate in your entry into activism? Why did you feel like you had to be active as opposed to just, being like, okay, these are the issues, I'm not going to personally participate in them, and that's sufficient? What made you feel like you had to go that extra step and become active?
I think it's part of that movement. There was lots of protest marches at the time. There was anti-racist protest marches, anti-capitalist protest marches, or protest actions, and it was kind of important for me not just to go on potentially marches, is actually do something, go slightly further than that. And so I got involved with this thing, hunt saboteuring, which in the UK was a very important entry point for people involved in animal activism. It's a sense of non-violent direct action where you'd actually disrupt a hunt trying to kill a fox or a hare, and your activities on a specific day could save the life of a specific animal. So it's a very, very direct way of getting involved with the animal rights movement. And so it was a logical step, and perhaps a lot of activists I know in the UK certainly have entered through that route, because it's a way that you can actually influence and save lives.
Definitely. That makes complete sense, and that the natural trajectory of learning what happens to animals eventually evolves into taking action. And I think the space at that time it seemed very like the resources were there to, okay, if this is the issue, you sought out resources to get
it's very much a DIY culture as well, which goes back to the ethics of in punk, do it yourself. You don't have to have these big studios to produce music. You can actually go and you learn 3 chords and you thrash away at a guitar. And it was very much the same as doing activism. You don't have to wait for another organization to say this is what you can do. You can actually organize in small groups. I went with a local group in where I live in Oxford in the UK, and we just had 10 people and just go out every couple of times a week and disrupt hunts. So you didn't have to have a massive organization levels, you didn't have massive levels of equipment. You just had to have perseverance and dedication, and willing to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah, that's definitely a struggle for me. But yeah, you touched a bit of on your that you had personally experienced racism, and owing to your Sri Lankan descent, what was it like participating in these actions? Did you feel out of place at all? What did you feel the representation was like? Are you able to tell us from your personal experience, what it was like?
I mean, the animal rights movement back in the 80s was a very white space. Sure. It was a very white space, and I would say the animal welfare movement in the UK is still very much a white space. I went to a couple of lectures, 500 people, probably to 800 people, and I was the only brown face there. And yeah, so that hasn't changed. I think the welfare space is very much a white space. I think the rights movement is actually changing, and becoming a bit more inclusive. But back then, it was a very, I stood out. And it was particularly hard, I would say, on disrupting hunts, because you certainly felt you'd get targeted, and I would have racist abuse, or people, the hunts people saying, I mean, these were violent people anyway, these weren't pleasant people, and they would, say, "Well, go." They would literally go back to your own country. Why are you telling me what to do? Out in the countryside, and they would have the accusation to the other colleagues, get back into the towns. We're the countryside people. You've got no place being here. But I had that extra level of antagonism by them. Yeah. So it was it was something that occurred.
Yeah, and what motivated you to keep going and not be deterred by that, keeping your safety in mind as well? And it sounds like the community you went to participate in these hunt sabs with sounds like they would have been a supportive, protective group of people that you felt safe enough to continue going. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely, and when you work in the hunt side movements, it's kind of a close knit group of people that you kind of work with, or you campaign with, and they are, and it's an actual very important precursor to investigations. You have to have a team that you can trust, and a team that's going to cover your back, type thing. And you have some great experiences, and you have some really horrific experiences, and it's kind of sharing those experiences, and at the end of the day, you sit down, have your cup of tea or whatever, and then just chat for 50, or chat for an hour or so, and just shoot the breeze about what happened during the day. And they were fully supportive people. They were very supportive people, and they're some of the people that I've known then, who I first, and I still keep in contact with today, who I truly admire.
Yeah, I love hearing that. We are in this fight together, but again, each of our experiences are going to be different depending on what kind of actions we take. And knowing that at the end of the day that you still have your community of activists who are going to have your back is so, so crucial. So thank you for sharing that story. And it's important, I think, especially given that we are wanting to create a safe and inclusive space, not just for the sake of having the diversity stamp in animal rights, but because it is the right thing to do, and we are all fighting against oppression, and it only makes sense to offer that kind of a community when we're doing this kind of work.
No, absolutely. It's important not to feel alone and to be inclusive, just as you said, not just for a stamp, but just for effectiveness, really, and not to isolate people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you went into filmmaking as your form of activism in raising awareness about animals. And before that, so which came first, your documentary work or the undercover work?
Well, they came at the same time.
Okay.
So really, I mean, I was very fortunate. I joined a radical film and video collective in the late 80s, and in Oxford in the UK, and its motto was give voice to those underrepresented in the mainstream media. And of course, animals have no voice. So it was a no-brainer for me to, when I first joined, to actually make a film about animals, basically, because other people at the workshop were making films about women and trade union history, labor rights,
Yeah.
women's rights.
Yeah.
They were talking about making films about the peace movement.
Also very important issues, yes.
All absolutely important. Yeah, these are all important issues about homelessness, human rights, and yeah, I fancied making a film about animal rights, and it was great because I had the opportunity. Back then, again, it was quite difficult to make films because you had to have professional editing equipment. For example, you couldn't do it on your computer. You couldn't do it on the iPhone.
Just have
you couldn't do it on the iPhone.
Yeah.
Exactly. So to actually make films back in the 80s, you had to have access to equipment. So I was very fortunate to have joined an organization which had access to this equipment. So in a way, I started my journey. I thought to myself, do I really want to be spending all my time doing hunt saboteur? Did I do something different because I had certain access to equipment? So I thought to myself, I could make films about animal rights. The first film, so I got together with 3 or 4 people, one person who was based at the workshop and a couple of other animal rights activists, to actually decide to make a film about factory farming and an undercover film about factory farming, because literally nobody had ever done that in the UK or within Europe at all. Nobody had gone into factory farms because the equipment was new. The equipment wasn't there and we had access to this equipment. So we just thought, let's do it. And it was a self-funded film. We took 2 years of occasionally holding stalls, animal rights stalls in the town to get money for petrol, to get money for VHS tapes. It was shot on, you probably don't even know what a VHS tape is.
I actually do. I think my very, very early years were probably the end of the era for VHS tapes.
Yeah. So sorry to be like that.
No, please. I'll take jabs at my age anytime.
So so it was early days of video production, and we spent 2 years getting access to factory farms. And again, these are the days before Google Maps, before the internet. So to actually research where these farms existed was the first place. Is where do these farms exist? So we'd go to the public library and look for. You'd have telephone directories or directories of we have in the UK Yellow Pages when they had pig producers, and they have farms, and they also had a whole series of maps in these libraries. So we'd sit in these libraries and then get these maps out and work out where the farms were. And in the UK, you have something called public footpaths, which you can legally walk, get access to across the land. And you're trying to work out where you could feasibly walk next to or nearby a farm, and you'd have a list of farms. And so that's why it kind of took 2 years to make this film, because there was a lot of research undertaken to actually identify the targets. So we got footage of factory farms of pigs, chickens, broilers, turkeys, laying hens. So we spent 2 years making this movie, and then it was called Meathead, and
I watched it.
It was kind of subtle, and again, that was a drama documentary, so we had the documentary aspect of using footage of factory farming, but we kind of wanted to have a different audience. It was a kind of a drama documentary, so we had a black surreal drama running through it. And going back to the punk roots, we got a couple of actors. One was called Lena Lovitch, who was a post-punk American, I do believe, a singer, and one was Captain Sensible, who was in this band called The Damned, and he was a big player The Damned produced the first ever punk record, 1977, before the Sex Pistols. And so they used to like kind of heroes, these people, and they volunteered to act in this film for free. And the film was accompanied by a soundtrack of musicians that we liked, etc. And yeah, we kind of made this film. Took 2 years, and then try to think, we've got to distribute this film. Where the hell are we going to distribute it? Because we hadn't thought about that. Because at that time there wasn't YouTube. So there was literally 5 terrestrial channels and 1 satellite channel. And we managed to get it on the satellite channel Sky. Oh. And so it was screened on Sky because Boy George, who's another 80s music icon, had a program on there, like an MTV type program.
Is that where you were interviewed on?
Exactly, yes. So back in 1990, they screened that film. They screened the film, and then I had to go into an interview. And I'd done no media training. I didn't really know what I'm talking about this film and factory farming. And it was great to get an audience for that film. It was a real great experience.
I thought you did a great job with that interview, and listeners, you definitely should watch Meathead. It's so interesting. Like the as soon as I finished watching it, I was like, whoa, I don't know what I watched, but I feel it was it was so obviously animal rights messaging, but wow, I was quite blown away by what you had, the fact that, that was the very first undercover investigation documentary film in the UK at the time, and the fact that that it was picked up by a satellite television. Like, how was it difficult to pitch it? Was there any reservations about featuring such such content, because it's not going to make people feel very comfortable about their food choices, that's for sure?
It was, I think at that time, it was a lot easier people weren't so reticent to show that type. Well, that specific channel or that specific program, I think it kind of went under the radar. They probably thought it was a music video. So I'm sure the people wouldn't have realized the exact content of it. So I think the legal people wouldn't have got too involved. But it was an interesting point. At that time, we had a big distributor, again, which was called a big record company, record shops in the UK. And basically there was 2. There was HMV and Our Price, and where everyone went and bought their records and bought their CDs, etc. And they came to us, and they just moved into the video market as well. And they came to us to potentially distribute our film into these shops. But they wanted us to cut out the final scene, which was a slaughter scene and of animals. At that time, we were very, very much against it, and we said no. This film comes in its entirety, and we won't make any cuts. In hindsight, 30 years on, I think I might have made a different decision, because I think I would have made a different decision. But at that time, I was a strident anarchist, and I still am a strident anarchist, but I didn't want to compromise my integrity. But I would probably compromise now to actually get to reach a bigger audience.
Okay, because I was gonna ask why you would have reconsidered that, but no, I understand that importance of reaching a bigger audience, but also the challenges of weighing that against your own morals and ethics, and feeling like you have to compromise on that. So that I feel like that's still an ongoing challenge in the movie.
And it's all filmmakers. They have that challenge. If somebody wants to cut something from your film, you don't really like it because it's something that you've nurtured for 2 years, and you think that's that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that revolutionary documentary, how did that progress into you working with animal protection groups and then starting tracks?
Well, so I made a couple of documentaries after that. The first one was, and I haven't told anyone about this before, so this is a revelation. It was a short form doc about the Animal Liberation Front called Animal Crimes. And this was for Channel 4, which is again one of the major the major terrestrial channels in the UK.
Does this exist in the interwebs?
No.
Oh no!
I haven't put it up there.
Top secret documentary.
I actually, you might inspire me to put it up there. It was 11-minute documentary, and it was the first documentary about the Animal Liberation Front that pushed the Animal Liberation Front in a positive spin, because there had been there had been a couple of programs talking about the Animal Liberation Front as terrorists, sure. As the normal, the terrorists, crazy people who
destroy
have no
property.
Disregard for life. And previous documentaries have been sensationalists, have portrayed kind, caring, compassionate people as violent terrorists. And so I wanted to portray a different picture. And we pitched an idea to Channel 4, one of the main 5 terrestrial broadcasters in the UK. And this was 1991, and it was a different time for television, and they were willing to take risks. And this particular channel was wanting to be an outlier and actually having an alternative viewpoint. And that was one of its mainstays at the time, is that we want to have an alternative viewpoint from the mainstream. And this was an alternative viewpoint to the mainstream. It was actually saying these animal rights activists aren't thugs. These are compassionate people, but they're involved in non-violent direct action. And I think our masterstroke for this film was actually telling the stories of the Animal Liberation Front through 2 activists who weren't your normal tattooed, young, how you'd imagine an animal rights activist would be. Sure. We chose 2 older people. One was a 60-year-old ex-butcher who spent his time, most of his life, as cutting up animals as a butcher. But then he had a kind of revelation and changed his life, and he ended up in jail for raiding an animal lab. And the other person we chose again was a 65-year-old pensioner, a woman, Nancy Phipps, whose daughter tragically died under the veal calf truck in the UK, in the later transport, Jill Phipps, in 1994. But her mother, which probably a lot of people don't know, was an animal rights activist as well. And she went to prison for, again, raiding an animal lab. So we kind of took away this stereotype that these people, animal rights activists, were crazy young anarchists, but they were actually people who all walks of life. And also it was a class issue, because these people weren't your traditional middle class. These were working class people who actually were concerned about animals. So it wasn't just a graduate thing, it wasn't just a student thing, it was actually across the board. And we put that program out on Channel 4, and it was just a short 11-minute documentary about the Animal Liberation Front. And it was a great excuse to get footage of animal laboratories. For example, we used the footage of breeches from the Peter investigation back in the late 80s. That was the first time that had been shown on British television. And we got footage of factory farms, and we had access to footage of Animal Liberation Front actions. So we kind of showed, what was going on. So we did that in 91. In 93, I made my next film, again for Channel 4, this was a longer 1-hour documentary about animal rights and the law, and how the law had been used to stifle animal rights protests. Because a lot of parallels from today, regarding today. In the early 90s in the UK, there was a real backlash against animal rights activists, like what we're seeing today. Like today we're seeing ag-gag laws, but back then in the 1990s, there was a number of laws being introduced to stifle protest. There was Public Order Acts, there was the libel laws, there was conspiracy laws, and it was all trying to literally target animal rights activists. Just trying to stifle the voice of it. And so we made a documentary telling stories basically about people, how they've been affected by this legislation, so by these various laws, from stories from people writing letters to their newspaper, their local newspaper, and then getting threatening letters from solicitors saying, we're going to sue you unless you retract that, to people organisations that had actually gone down. There was an organisation called Lynx, which was an anti-fur organisation, and their main CEO had called a fur farm a hellhole. He'd actually called them a hellhole, and he was libelled by the fur industry, and the organisation collapsed. He lost his house, and there was a real backlash. And this is just literally calling a farm a hellhole in print, and he was libelled and lost everything. And so there was a real backlash about it. So that was another story to be told. And so that program went out in the early 90s, 1993. And then I've put a few more proposals into Channel 4 about other programs, and they weren't getting picked up.
I wonder if they just caught on to the animal rights agenda that you had, or I don't know, just because it seems like a pretty constant challenge is getting this content out, getting quote unquote mainstream media or press attention. And do you see any differences with that since, or at least different kinds of challenges from then versus now, or is it about the same? What do you think?
It's interesting. I mean, we at the moment at Tracks, we don't actually distribute material. We let the organisations that we work with distribute the material. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. I was actually talking to somebody who'd made an animal rights film yesterday, and they were trying to get it on Netflix, etc. And they were having problems with that and the mainstream distributors, so they're going to distribute it independently. So I think there's always been challenges of trying to get material on the mainstream media. There's always been a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge now.
It's a smart move for you too. You're doing all this important undercover work, but you're getting it to the mainstream. I'm just going to ease myself of that additional thing to stress over.
Exactly. I mean, I should say, at Tracks. So at Tracks, we've been doing investigations for 15 years. We've done over 260 projects for 40 NGOs in 58 countries. So we kind of go across the globe. But our main aim really is to act as a service provider for getting content for animal protection organisations. And so we kind of specialise in getting undercover footage. What we don't do is distribute it to the media. We literally get the footage and then pass it on to the groups who got their own personnel, who've got their own staff, and can actually get it out there. So we kind of don't have that facilities, and so we don't have that headache of worrying about it. We let them worry about it.
Definitely. And so what inspired you to start Tracks as what sounds more like, a contract undercover group that gets footage specifically for other organizations who have certain campaigns? Or does Tracks also, or do you do your own campaigns and own investigations as well? Or is it strictly for other organizations?
So I should just give you a backstory. So after I did the television work, I then set up the investigations unit at Compassion in World Farming. And this was an animal welfare organisation, and it was quite a radical move for an animal welfare investigation organisation to set up an investigations unit. And again, that was the first one in Europe that had done that, to look into farm animal welfare, certainly. And so I headed up
so many things. That's so cool.
So I headed that up for about 7 years. That was in 1997 till 2000, and then moved to an organisation called Cruelty Free International, which was called BUAV, which is in animal research. So heading up their investigations unit, doing investigations into animal labs. So I'd kind of got the investigative bug by then, so from my original working back doing Meathead to working at Compassion in World Farming, doing lots of investigations on factory farming, long distance animal transport, to animal lab research at Cruelty Free International. And then I kind of wanted to do it all. I didn't really want to specialize in just one aspect. So that's kind of why we set up Tracks in 2006, to really look at how we use animals for all types of, all the ways that we use animals for food, fashion, entertainment, research, and not specialize in one specific area. And we saw a gap, really. I'd helped a couple of organizations by working with them with their investigations unit. And I think realized there was a growing need for having investigative material for all these organizations, for a number of organizations. So that's why we set it up, because we kind of saw there was a need and a market. And, we were probably one of the first organizations, this was 2006, 15 years ago that we started. And now you'll see a number of organizations getting into that space, really, of doing investigations. So there is a need. There's always been a need. And I'm really pleased there are more organizations doing this.
Yes, 100%. They are a very important tool in our toolbox. And for you, through your years of doing undercover work, do you think anything has changed, or are there any new issues currently that weren't present in the past, or vice versa? What can you speak to us a little bit about that?
I think, the purpose of investigation is always to create change. That's the raison d'etre. That's why we start doing investigations. And change kind of really happens when there's public outrage. And then when there's public outrage, that puts pressure on legislators to actually put legislation in place. And so we've seen through our investigations a number of public outrages, a number of legislations actually put place. But in general, some things have changed. Some things have got better, but sometimes it takes time. It takes time, and you kind of have to be. I've been involved with this movement, since 35 years, and I've seen incremental change. You don't come in doing animal welfare, animal protection for quick hits, really. You've got to be in it for the long haul, because change happens. Change doesn't happen overnight, and if you expect things to happen overnight, you'll get disillusioned. I think that's one. But I have seen change. I have seen better welfare. I have seen the growth of the vegan movement. People becoming aware. So so that's why I have seen change within the last 30 years, 35 years.
Sure. And you did mention some legislative victories as well. Do you recall which one maybe stood out to you the most? What was like the biggest legal win that maybe was unexpected, or that you really put all that work into?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we've done at Tracks, we've done the last 15 years, probably about 260 projects.
That's a lot.
And so now I'm trying to think which ones. I think the most ones have a legislative effect is on fur farming in Europe. We've investigated this issue in 2 countries, in France and in Belgium, since 2009. We've probably been to over 50 fur farms in Europe. And there's something really important about fur farms because it's for fashion, and I really can't get, and I suppose your listeners will resonate, that there really is absolutely no need for using fur or animals for fashion. And when you see fur, these are wild animals, Arctic foxes, mink, who normally roam hundreds of miles potentially, in their natural habitat, and they're kept in these small, cramped cages, wire cages, and they kind of go crazy within these cages, having these stereotypical behaviors. And it's something, I think it can resonate with the public and legislators, going back to the purpose of investigations. I think you can create public outrage by showing the conditions within these farms. And, some of the conditions that we showed was cannibalism with these farms, of mink actually gnawing at themselves, gnawing at their fellow companions, because they've got 5 mink in a small contained cage, wild animals, and they're going to go crazy and they're going to start attacking each other. And we've documented that. So we first started, so going back to the question of legislative change, we investigated 3 times. Twice we went to Belgian farms, visited all the farms over a period of, in 1 year we did 17, the next year, in the next 2 years we filmed in 13. And we worked with a great organisation called Gaia, which is based in Belgium, and they got a ban on fur farms in Belgium, and back in 2000 and originally 2017 and 2018. And so we've got legislative change. And then we moved on to France and worked with another organisation called One Voice. And we did 3 investigations over a period of 5 years. And last year, as a result of these investigations and the public pressure, fur farming has been banned in France. And earlier this year, the last fur farm closed its doors. So, and that's actually had a snowball effect as well, because first of all, Belgium went, then France went, and now Italy has gone. We have done investigations in Italy, and it's going throughout Europe.
With leading designers as well. A lot of designers are starting to.
We have seen. Yeah. So 2009, when hadn't really been any legislative movement, we've actually seen change happen. And the other thing I should say about Tracks is that this is the beauty of Tracks, is we work with great NGOs, because we can't do everything by ourselves. So, we try and choose organisations that we work with that don't just have a media hit, that actually work with legislators, that actually have political action, because to be an effective investigation, it doesn't have to be just about media. It's about all Facebook likes or Instagram likes. It's actually about an integral part of the project. So we like to work with organisations that can work with legislators, that have lobbying arms as well, because we're not lobbyists. So we pass over our footage to these people who can do that. So I would say that would be our most effective thing, because it's stopped fur farming in 2 countries, and it's had a snowball effect on many other countries within Europe. And fur farming, I do believe, is it's a dying industry, certainly in Europe.
Yes, definitely. And these victories, they're amazing, and and I imagine it comes back to what you talked about, being in it for the long run and continuing to do the work and keep at it, and not expect everything to change tomorrow, but coming in, being prepared for that, and working.
Yeah, because change doesn't happen overnight. I mean, we have had some investigations that have had quick hits, that have actually, that have released animals from the terrible conditions that they've been in. We filmed 3 performing bears in France, which were kept in these horrible dungeon type conditions. And as a result of our footage, those bears were then released and sent to a sanctuary. And we did a very similar one. We filmed 9 tigers kept on the back of a lorry, basically in winter quarters, and they were part of a circus. And we filmed them for 6, 7 days. We put hidden cameras overlooking their quarters to show that they didn't actually move out of these lorries. And as a result, the organisation then lobbied the authorities and again got them released to sanctuaries. So we have also, as well as the legislative angle, we actually have impacted lives on individual animals as well. But it's kind of, so yeah, occasionally we do have quick hits, and by a quick hit, I mean, we're talking under a year.
Yeah, within animal rights time scale. Yeah. And without revealing your techniques and ways of getting this footage, it sounds like, in the early days, this undercover work, that wasn't really a thing. So it wasn't as much of a challenge to obtain this footage. But now, we're seeing ag laws and all sorts of attempts to silence activists and either hinder their ability to get this footage. So as these industries catch on to these tactics, how have you been able to be flexible in your techniques and being able to do this kind of work across the globe?
I think each country has got its own challenges. So you've got to approach each investigation on an individual basis. I mean, some things have got easier, some things have got more difficult. Technology has helped with investigations, so, in the early days, going back to the original days of entering a factory farm, we had massive cameras that we had to carry on our back, etc., and trips across fields, and didn't have access to the internet. And these days you kind of got the internet, you got Google Maps, so you can do a lot more research. Regarding obstacles to it, I mean, there've always been obstacles to investigation. We judge each project as it comes, really, and then attempt to try and get the desired results.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And one thing that I really was keen on talking to you about was, the famous Paul McCartney quote that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we would all be vegetarian. And I think that undercover footage that's out there is the glass wall that a lot of these really brave activists are putting out there. And we don't necessarily see that. I mean, yes, we're seeing progression towards a more plant-based food system, at least just coming from the food angle, but other angles of animal exploitation for whatever human purpose. So do you think there is something that can be done differently to spark that larger scale change within a shorter time frame, or behavioral change, especially since people aren't necessarily going out of their way to seek this footage unless they're probably already within animal rights or they're already thinking about it. It's not the everyday person who's looking for this material. It's this out of sight, out of mind concept. So how do you think the work that undercover investigations do can maybe bridge that in a more effective way? Or do you think that's something that's needed?
Well, going back to the quote, I've always believed in the power of the image, and as a change or campaigning tool. I think it's probably, for me, it's the most important campaigning tool that you can have. And I'm going back to the days when I worked within organisations, and some legislators had read reports and hadn't been convinced about the need for change. But when they're actually confronted with documentary evidence of suffering, it's a human emotion. They have been affected by it. So I think the investigations have a great opportunity to create that change. And it's not always it's not always due to the individual consumer, but it's also to the legislator. And investigative footage I mean, there's so many different platforms for investigative footage these days, whereas when I first started out, you literally had a few terrestrial stations, and then you'd have to distribute the videos, via news networks, etc., or organize screenings. I remember organizing Meathead, the film that I made in 1988 about factory farming, at a big rock festival, the biggest music festival in the UK, because one of my side hustles is I used to organize the cinema tent at one of these rock festivals. And as well as putting mainstream films out there, I decided to slip in as a trailer Meathead. So you've got 4,000 or 5,000 people wanting to watch Pulp Fiction or the next major action video, and then you put in this alternative video, and this is happening these days as well, that you're getting ways to actually distribute investigative material. I mean, we've shown a footage that I made for Cruelty Free International about an animal laboratory in Spain, got 980,000 views, just under 1 million views, about an animal liberation, about an animal lab investigation in Spain. So, these are major figures for something, that can be quite a hard watch. So there are alternative distribution channels, and yes, there's street activists getting very creative about showing footage, in the streets. So yeah, there's lots of distribution channels to actually get this material out, and I think there is there's more opportunities for people to actually see this material now.
Yeah, totally. And within tracks, or your other experiences doing undercover work at other organizations, did you feel that the representation in terms of culture and diversity within these higher risk undercover work was also similar to your Hunt Sab experiences? Were you the only person of South Asian descent doing this?
Yes, I would say. I mean, I don't know, certainly within the UK, of any other investigators, of South Asian heritage. I'd like to say one thing we have at Tracks is we have about 10 regular investigators, and 70% of them are women. And so it's not really a macho world. When we first started, we had potentially one investigator out of 10 that was a woman, one woman out of 10. And it's something that I've been kind of conscious to do, is increasing diversity within investigations, and to actually show that it's not just a macho activity, investigations. There's lots of skills involved in investigations. And yeah, I've tried to make our organizations a bit more diverse, and just realize that you don't, your stereotypical idea of an investigator being a white male macho techie person doesn't necessarily have to be the right one. There are lots of different diverse opportunities to get involved with investigations. And yeah, I mean, regarding people with Asian Black descent, I haven't, I am the only one that I'm aware of in the UK, but I would certainly perhaps need to be searching out for more,
But maybe you're providing a framework for that to just be a norm, and also a safe place, as safe as possible, for people who might be called to do this kind of work but are afraid of either standing out, not blending in. It maybe, like you said, a white techie pro person is always the undercover investigator. Like, we're just gonna redraft that narrative.
And and absolutely, I mean, there's certain types of investigations that I could never do. I mean, we organised as Tracks, we did some investigations into the trapping industry in the US, and I went undercover, had an investigator go undercover for a few weeks over a couple of years, doing infiltrating the fur trapping industry. And that's something I knew I couldn't do. I knew as a brown face within a trapping community that just wouldn't work. So in that case, we had to employ somebody who would fit into that environment. But there's other opportunities that you think you're going to stand out, but you blag it. I went into again another investigation into into the broiler industry, and we couldn't trespass into these farms. We were asked by the organisation that we were working that we weren't allowed to do any trespass, so we had to come into a way of getting access to these farms. So myself and a partner, we decided that we were going to potentially buy these farms. So we engaged an estate agent to give us a tour of broiler units for over about 10 days. And I was the investor. My colleague was going to be actually running the farm.
Nice.
We kind of went into the so you've got to be ingenious about how you can actually get access to these farms. So we had guided tours, and we learned so much more about the industry than if we just sneaked in at night, because these farmers were actually wanting to sell the farm, so they had no problem with us actually filming exactly what was going on in the farm, and we were able to ask loads of questions about the industry, about the cull rates, about everything about the farms. So yeah, you've got to be kind of creative in our way of trying to get access to farms. So sometimes having a different color skin isn't a barrier, and you don't stand out even though you think you might do.
That was I think you'd shared that story once, and I was like, that is so smart. And I mean, of course, you can't use that same tactic all the time, but you got to gauge the situation accordingly.
Exactly. I mean, that's the beauty of investigations, and that's why I love them, really, because each project is a puzzle. You've got to think, okay, how the hell are you going to get this footage? And sometimes you think it's mission impossible. You think, God, I'm never going to be able to get this footage. And then you sit down and you actually think outside the box, really, and think of some of the crazy scenarios of how you can potentially build up cover stories to access the footage. So, we've been tourists, we've been journalists, we've been, God, I don't know what we've been. Crazy tour. Yeah, we've been just a lot of different scenarios. Business people, often we have fake websites, for example, and we're set up as fake businesses to actually get access to material. So we have a lot of hats on at Tracks, really.
I'm glad you're sharing all this with us, but I mean, hopefully none of I'm sure, secrets of the animal rights ways are not so much secrets, but sometimes you never know when they'll catch on. But
well, the thing is, you've always got to evolve.
Yeah,
we're always
exactly.
evolving new ways of actually doing investigations. So yeah, we're always evolving because they'll always catch on to something, and yeah, we have to adapt.
Definitely. And when you do this undercover work, I'd imagine there's a lot of mental and emotional tolls of being in a space where you're seeing the suffering, you're not able to actually go in and rescue the animals. How do you navigate that? And also sometimes having to blend in, you might have to consume animal products. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, it's tricky. It's tricky, and there's no easy answer to say. Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, when you go into a factory farm, kind of all your senses are attacked. You see horrific sights, you hear horrific sounds, you smell horrific smells, etc. And ammonia, for example, of chickens, but you kind of, when you're in the moment, you're hiding behind a camera. That's when you're actually filming specific abuse or you're filming slaughter. That is the initial shield. that's between you and the animal. And that can be an effective shield, because you're kind of focusing on trying to get the right images. You're not thinking, you're kind of detaching yourself from what you're seeing, basically. You're focusing on getting the material, thinking about shot sizes, shot types. You're thinking about all the things that before you go into a farm, you have a whole list of shots that you want to be able to get. So you're kind of focusing on that element. And other coping mechanisms, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, there's no easy answer, really. I think the most important thing is to remember is those images are not for you to keep, really. So you've got to try and get them out of your head. And what motivates us is when they go out into the wider world. They've gone from out of your head into the wider world, and then create change. And that kind of works for mental well-being, really. That they've gone out there. They're not stuck within one's head.
Yeah, I really do appreciate all of the insights and experiences that you've shared so far, and especially coming to the value of taking care of your mental well-being when you're just so often confronted with just the atrocities and horrors of animal abuse, and just kind of keeping that in mind when you're in these spaces. There are also a lot of chances of really close encounters and almost blowing your cover. So have you had any such experiences like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most often asked question, actually, that people ask about investigations. Is it dangerous? What close call have you had? And I think we've been quite fortunate to have not had to have any horrific experiences at tracks. I mean, a lot of that's down to meticulous planning of investigations. We don't take any investigations lightly. It's literally research, 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 and without going through writing lots and lots of paper risk assessments, we actually think about the risks, we talk about the risks, and we try and mitigate the risks. And I mean, there have been some occasions where we've had potentially close calls that we've actually have been caught in farms. And our best form of defense, really, is that myself and most of the investigators that I work with have got a press card. We are journalists. We've joined the National Union of Journalists, the accredited union of journalists. So we're not seen as animal rights activists. And that's really diffused a few situations that we have been caught, because people then don't see us as crazy animal libbers, but they see us as bona fide journalists trying to get a story. And that changes the dynamic from potential aggression, they'll call the authorities, they'll call the police, and then you have a tricky situation that when you're dealing with the police, that you have to explain that you're not an animal libber, that you're actually a bona fide journalist, trying to cover a story of public interest, which is what we are. I mean, this is the bottom line. We are people, this is in the public interest to get stories of animal abuse out there. So that has been our number one savior, really. I've been in a situation where I was following live export trucks carrying young calves throughout Europe, on massive, long, over 1,000-kilometer journeys. And the lorry driver called the police on us, basically. And this was back in Italy in 2002, so not after 9/11. And I think they thought we were terrorists. So literally, it was like kind of out of a movie. So the cars, this flashing car, two flashing police cars came out and pulled us out of our cars, literally spread eagled on the side of the car, patting us down for guns or whatever. And it was crazy at that time. I actually had the hidden camera attached to my body because I was just about to go into a veal farm, and I was thinking, oh my God, this could be dangerous, because literally after 9/11, having somebody having a camera with wires attached to your body, what they think is going to be. But luckily they didn't touch that. And they were being quite aggressive. And I just said, in my back pocket, there's a press card. I am a journalist. I am a journalist. And that totally diffused the situation, from thinking we were anarchists, we were animal libbers. They actually then realized, okay, now we've got to deal with a different scenario. If they are journalists, we are accredited journalists, we pay internationally accredited journalists, they've had to treat us slightly differently. So that's one way we've actually got out of close calls, really, because that's our number one defense, as it were, that when we have been potentially caught. But we don't like to be caught. We really do try and do everything in our powers not to be caught. And our investigators have had some military training, for example, and we have the right equipment. We have thermal imaging cameras, so we can see in the dark. We have infrared detection cameras, so we can see when there's surveillance cameras and beams, etc. So we try our very utmost not to get caught.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty decent goal to have, just to not get into any trouble, but it also helps to have a solid safety net if and when that does happen.
Yeah.
Since, you are an established organization, you have a legit website, and is there ever a concern for safety, not necessarily while you're doing undercover work, but the fact that, hey, there is this undercover investigative organization, got to keep an eye out, and do you receive any threats from industries at all?
No, basically, is the short answer. And the beauty of that is because most of our material, all our material, is put out by the animal protection organisations that.
So they bear the brunt of it, not you, basically.
Exactly, and if they put out all the footage, and I should say they get legal advice when they're putting out their footage. They work with lawyers, and we work with those lawyers about how we obtain the material. So we have codes of conduct of how we obtain the material and make sure that we don't breach any particular legislation. And so that we get legal advice prior to the investigation, and the organisations that we work with get legal advice regarding putting the material out. So we haven't had any direct feedback because there is that barrier, and that's the one advantage of nobody knowing that tracks exist, really. Because we've done work for PETA, we've done Mercy for Animals, Born Free, a whole host of organisations, and our name doesn't exist anywhere along the line. So if any industries are going to go for it, they'll go for the organisation that's put it out. And we have a website, we have a very minor social media presence, because I really hate social media and it's not for me. So if Tracks was a more well-known organisation, we might get more comeback. But I think it's we're not very well known outside of the organisations that we work for.
And I think that's a smart, whether it was intentional or not, or the fact that you don't like social media is probably working to your advantage. Like you're not necessarily on any large radars.
Yeah, I mean this goes back to when I did the program about animal rights and the law back 20 years ago, when I realized that there was real threats from the state and companies trying to infiltrate and trying to be aware of animal rights organizations. So social media isn't for me, because it's I admire yourself doing so much media, and I just think when I do look at Instagram, I think, how do people have the time to consume it?
It's a lot. I will admit.
And I tell you, it also helps my mental health as well, because one of the beauties of tracks is that we don't have to do social media. It means I'm not personally engulfed 24/7 within the world of animal rights. And that's in one way that I've kept sane, really, is because I do have a life outside of animal rights. Animal rights is very important to me. It's kind of what I've been doing for 35 years, but I have a real life outside it. So, most of my friends aren't vegan, are regular, are, and I don't inhabit a world where everyone, I'm talking animal rights issues 24/7, so that's kept me sane, really. So I'm not in this bubble, whereas, I kind of interact with regular folk, and I like that.
Yeah, I'm still quite interesting to me. It's like you're not a vegan and one of your good friends is an activist undercover investigator. Like, if that doesn't get you to go vegan, come on.
But until 2 years ago, I don't think a lot of people knew what I do. I didn't actually, people didn't know, even some of my close friends, until did some of these podcasts, didn't know the work that I did. I've just said, oh, I just make films.
Yeah.
So I've never gone into detail about the work that I've done. So, and I don't, and a lot of people that I know don't, I don't broadcast the fact that I'm an undercover activist. A lot of people just see as Gem, the footballer, or Gem, the person who goes to concerts, etc. So they won't know, I don't, they wouldn't.
Not so much undercover anymore when you're just going about telling everybody that's what you do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's, you're right there. But again, regarding the type of projects that I do, my going on podcasts isn't going to affect that at all. So it's I choose the specific projects, and lately I haven't gone so much into the field because we're doing so many projects at Tracks, and I'm generally coordinating most of the projects. At the moment, we've got a project in Eastern Europe, we've got a project going out to France tomorrow, we've got a project. Wow. Yeah, we've got stacks of projects, so I'm kind of coordinating them all at the moment and editing, and that's keeping me incredibly busy.
I bet. So we're almost done here. You've offered so much here, and I'm sure our listeners are just going to be nothing short of inspired. And speaking of inspirations, we do focus on mentorship a lot, and in animal activism mentorship, we like to provide guidance, mentorship, and support to new activists and seasoned activists alike who are wanting to put their best selves forward for the animals. So who have been those sources of inspiration for you? And not necessarily have to be in animal rights, but just mentors who have inspired you to do what you're doing.
That's a really good question. I think there is one person that comes to mind, and it was the guy. His name's called Joe Hashman. Anybody should Google him. He's an animal rights activist that I have known for 30 years, 35 years, and is a good colleague, friend, mostly friend. When I first got involved with animal rights, he was running the Hunt Saboteur group that I joined. And he was a 16-year-old at the time, and I was probably about 18, 19. And he ran this Hunt Saboteuring group. And he was slightly different because most of us at that time were punks and hippies, but he actually came in it from a very, very traditional love of animals. And he kind of inspired me to show you that. And he just literally got on with the project and got on with Hunt Saboteuring and nurtured an incredibly supportive group. And he got me involved originally with animal rights. I then had the pleasure of working with him at Compassion in World Farming, because when I first set up the investigations unit, I thought, okay, I need to find some investigators. Who the hell do I need? Who do I know? So I went back to my Hunt Saboteuring friends, And he did a number of investigations for me that were really, really important. And I think he's a great guy because he also did the precursor, um, of setting up veganism and as a religious belief, basically. He got discriminated at work and he took his employer to court, saying that he was discriminated because of his belief of sanctity of life.
Was this the investor case? Then is that what the company was investing in?
This was a precursor. So
precursor to that. I was like, this person? Okay.
This guy, really interesting. So Joe actually took his employer to court, saying that he believed in the sanctity of life. And
okay.
And interestingly, the guy that you're talking about is called Geordie, who actually asked Joe for advice, and he got veganism as a protected belief. So he inspired this guy called Geordie, who's written books and about veganism. So this guy Joe has inspired so many people, and and also he's a really nice guy, and he's also inspired me to start a soccer team, because which is really important to me, because normally you think of these people as he had his team called Shaftesbury Anarchists, and they went into a traditional football soccer league. This was back 22
I like that you said
years
soccer,
ago,
knowing that a decent amount of our listeners are in America. So
and I 22 years ago set up this organized a soccer team called Union Street, and our motto is love, peace, freedom. We have a picture of a badger, and it's to show that you can disrupt normal activity by having an alternative viewpoint. And it's much like veganism. You actually show people an alternative viewpoint, and you don't bash them around the head, but you actually think, okay, this is a completely different way of doing things. I'm rambling here, but Joe's a great inspiration. He's a great guy. You should Google him, Joe Hashman, and he's just got a new book of poems out about life and everything else and animals.
I'm sure he's very proud of the work that you're doing, and it's just I love hearing how people within the community just they just want what's best for the world and the animals and all of the creatures who live on this planet. And along the way they spark these really passionate activists who are going out and doing remarkable things in the world. So I love hearing that. And what advice would you give to new activists, seasoned activists, or even those who are interested in investigations? Because you've seen so much over the course of these years. You've had to pivot based off of new technology or new mindsets, new issues, and new conversations in the animal rights movement. So what advice would you give to people?
Get involved with what you do best, really, and don't think you have to do everything, because there's so many different facets of being an animal activist. And for example, I absolutely hate doing street stalls. I don't like speaking to people. I'm absolutely petrified of doing public speaking. That's something I can't do. I'd rather investigate an industry than speak to 100 people in an auditorium. So just realize what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then focus on what you really want to do. So if you like leafleting, if you like campaigning, if you like public speaking, do it, but don't think you have to do it all. And the other thing is, and what inspired me was this DIY ethic of punk, and we'll go back to that, because I think it's very much do it yourself and do it with colleagues. You don't have to you don't have to join an organizer. You don't have to wait for something. You don't feel like you can just do it. Just try. You can make mistakes. So I would really encourage people to choose the type of activism that you want to do and try a few different types, and realize they might not all be right for you, and just give it a go, because the animals will love you for it.
Oh, I love that. They will really love, appreciate, and yeah, that's for just doing whatever we can. And a question I personally love to wrap up with is, what is your vision for a kind, just vegan world? And we're defining vegan here as a social justice narrative, and not just about what we buy in stores, but how we live our lives. So, how do you envision that?
It's really interesting because I don't really have a vision. I I tell you why. I last organization I worked with, I have this real issue with the word vision because there was in this organization that I worked with, they got marketing consultants, branding consultants that talked about vision and values, and it really smacked of corporate branding to me. And it really, when anybody says a vision, or
Okay,
I see vision
let's throw the word vision out then.
on a website, I absolutely, it really brings my heckles up, and that's a personal thing. And I don't have a vision, but I do have hope. I do have
Okay. Oh, like what is your vegan?
hope.
Let's screw the word vision. Like,
So, I do hope that we can live kindly with our fellow species, basically, that we explore and innovate so we don't have to use animals for food, fashion, entertainment, and research. I think there's so many opportunities now that the world isn't just to deal with animal rights investigators, deals or activists that people are championing alternative viewpoints, for example, so animal rights issues and vegan issues is being championed by activists, but also by educators, legislators, innovators, entrepreneurs. And that's my hope, that we can continue that expansion. So animal rights isn't just an activist work, it actually goes throughout the whole of society, really. So that's my hope, and it's happening, and I hope it can continue. So yeah, sorry, it's not a vision, but it's a hope.
Whatever, we can use whatever word we want here, but yes, I now every time I see the word vision, I'm gonna think of you now.
It was because I was within this charity, and they spent thousands. They spent thousands on branding consultants, and of course, it probably helped. It probably helped them raise funds, but I just I was in so many vision and values meetings that I decided to
like
leave
I
the
have no vision,
organisation
I
and
have
set
no
up
values.
tracks.
So, how can our listeners support the work you do? I know social media is not your favorite, but of course, we'll link it in case folks want to follow. But how can they support the work you do? Is there anything that we can do for tracks and, um, encourage all of the fabulous things that you do?
Well, we have a website, which is www.tracksinvestigations.org.
It is not a fake website.
It's not a fake website. No, that's a real website. I do have some fake websites in operation at the moment, which I won't direct your listeners to.
Nope.
But we also have social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, tracks.ecospooks, and occasionally I post on there. And if your listeners ever want to help out with my social media activities, do get in touch, because it's not my world, but I think it might. There's obviously opportunities if people want to help promote the work of animal rights and things. Do get in touch. I thought that was really nice that you actually asked me a question about animal research via social media, and I was thinking, actually, perhaps this is a medium that you can actually have an interaction. So yeah, do get in touch, ask questions, and yeah, please do.
Wow. Oh, that's so nice of you to say. I honestly, I remember following you, and then you requested to follow back, and you responded to my question. I was like, whoa. Because at that point, I was going through that transition phase of not wanting to be in grad school, wanting to leave, and I was listening to so many podcasts. And you are definitely one of the people who inspired me to really follow my passion. And so I really looked up to folks like you, are interviewed on a lot of these podcasts. And when I hear back from them, I'm like, wow, celebrity fangirl moment. So that's what I still pinch myself that I get to speak with people like you who have just been such inspirations to me and are just so unapologetically liberationists. And really, I just can't thank you enough, and the community that you've built, and then the people who you will go on to inspire. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And yeah, I think this community, we all inspire each other. I really respect that people come back to you, and sometimes it's kind of an isolating world. So, when people actually respond on social media with not just a like, but a question, it's brilliant, because it's an interaction, and interactions is where you build communities, isn't it? So, and that's part of that. What you're doing with animal activism mentorship is absolutely inspiring, because it's actually building a community where you're helping, and that's another way we create change. We're not going to do it by ourselves. So so thank you.
Thank you, totally. And as you can already tell, I have no shortage of questions. So wow. I truly admire Gem's humility, especially in light of all of his magnificent accomplishments. It's always inspiring to hear the perspectives of longtime activists who have seen the growth of the animal rights movement from their early days and how it's evolved to what it is right now. It would behoove us all to learn from their knowledge and draw inspiration from their anecdotes. Plus, I imagine that undercover work can be quite isolating, and I'm grateful that Gem was willing to join us and share his stories with our growing community of passionate activists. So if Gem's work at Trax Investigations is calling to you, check out the links in our show notes and get connected to Gem. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. We will also be sure to provide the links to some of his early films. They are a must-watch, in my not-so-biased opinion. Before we sign off, please take a quick minute to rate and review the podcast. It helps others find it more easily, and the more people who find it, the more they can be inspired by the guests we interview and turn that into actionable change for the animals. Plus, if you have any guest suggestions for whom you'd like to see featured on our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to check out our website, animalactivismmentorship.com, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as all things AAM. Accessibility to our content without any hindrance is key to our work here at AAM. That's why it's important to us that we offer our resources for free. So if you like what we do at the Animal Liberation Hour and at AAM, and would like to support us, of course, given that you have the financial ability to do so, please feel free to contribute to our Patreon. It helps keep us going. AAM is proud and honored to be fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. So if you are still waiting for that sign that you should be an activist for the animals, this is it. Now remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation. And as my good friend and co-host Trey says, it is not a sprint, it is a marathon. So we've got to stay focused, stay positive, take care of ourselves, and be the change of compassion that we envision for this world. Until next time.